Ouroboros.
I skipped over some stuff to focus on addressing my thing against the solar system's execution in this game, namely that being Fay and Ellie fleeing for their lives as Solaris' security catches on to them being there, as their friends in the interim of their infiltration have been captured, set to be executed soon. We take refuge, after a long trip through the sewers, because there always is, with Ellie's parents, to give the obligatory suitor being threatened story point to progress Fay and Ellie's thing for one another, and to see how deep the Solarian indoctrination runs as they just keep getting lied to only reinforce the lies. And even the people here live lies they tell themselves. Case in point, Ellie's mom that we meet, it doesn't look like she's her real mom, evidenced by Ellie being a redhead while her parents are blondes. The way Ellie tells it is her father took pity on a surface dweller that became a third-class citizen and took that woman into their home. And Ellie implies that her father had sex with her, which resulted in Ellie. Unfortunately though, this is all from Ellie's perspective, though it acts to explain why Ellie, with time at least, is more compassionate towards non-Solarians to become the ally she is, as she thinks her true mother is actually one of them. Which she feels explains the frankly frigid distance between her blonde mom and her, while her father is a workaholic serving the palace. And for the most part, nothing comes of this beyond a recurring plotline from here on out of Ellie not being the most wise of individuals. But honestly, this dynamic between parent and child reminds me in a way of Callan from Code Geass, as a similar familiar relationship is shown at play in the series. Even if the backstory behind that take is different, and Ellie's mom keeps insisting that she is Ellie's biological mother, as opposed to the mess that Callan's home life is. Then again, as I've said, not the first parallel nor the most overt one Code Geass shares with the Xenogears. But the advantage to Ellie's dad being a workaholic in service to the Emperor directly is he has among the highest clearance regarding the security system. Thus, once we get a chance to access his system using Ellie's full name spelled backwards, we can find a route to getting to them that takes us through the sewage network. Because there always is! But Ellie's dad learning she accessed his system makes him attempt to kill Fay, as any sign of treason has the same punishment as an acting of third class or below: death. Fay tries to take all the blame on himself even though Ellie did everything, with this act ironically earning Fay Ellie's dad's respect, but he is summarily arrested when the Royal Guard come instead under Krelian's orders. The Gazelle Ministry intended to use this traitor as a test subject, and Ellie's dad refusing to let her be harmed, allowing her to follow after Fay and summarily meet up with Satan, who shows up in a soldier outfit that he's been using to infiltrate, already knowing the full situation. Sus. This newest behind-the-scenes network is what leads us to the Soylent system and the revelations attached to it, how Ellie's dad used to run it, and Maria's dad had the subjects of his human-machine interface disposed of in it. They're all complicit in this. Even Satan was in the past when he was in service to Solaris. We go past even more research subjects, as well as more Omni gears in storage, ones that are absolutely enormous, until finally reaching the Gazelle Ministry's life extension experiments, where our cast has been detained for use as new bodies for the digitally stored Ministry members, with Satan revealing all the details about this. Which begs the question, how does Satan know all of this? After all, he appeared to only have been so high up in the military, and I doubt these parts of it are common knowledge. Well, that is answered, not just by that earlier scene of Cain and Satan talking, but by this being a trap. Ellie figuring that out too late to do anything, by the snap realization that even the highest levels of the military don't have the access that Satan is casually submitting. None of their other former Solarian members could do this either, and considering all game long Satan's been Fay's handler, Satan has been working for them all along. You changed, man. You used to be cool. Fay and Ellie at this point are captured, Fay forced to watch footage of him acting as Id throughout the game. The Ministry continuing the blame game with regards to Fay's existence as the contact repeatedly preventing their communication with Deus. It was Satan's duty to eventually guide Fay to Solaris alongside the beings Fay would collect that would serve as their new bodies, which had been genetically bred over the centuries to serve their new roles as the Ministry's reborn flesh, so they may travel in person to the stars once more once they succeed in reviving Deus by sacrificing Fay to the monster that stranded them here. For their god has given them the right to rule the universe. Man, considering how advanced the spacefaring humanity was 10,000 years ago, I can only imagine what their tech level is at now that would completely surpass the Deus system, regardless of the Zohar powering it. So, them ruling the universe? Not this one. Which makes everything they've done worthless. Granted, that's assuming Deus and its most faithful servant wouldn't just kill them just on the principle of slamming them down for their arrogant presumption.
Krelian also has his hands on Ellie, and using the nanites taken from Esmeralda to increase the efficiency of a scanning machine, has now determined the energy that has tethered Fay and Ellie to their reincarnation cycle. A ring of Ouroboros.
And that's the major mistranslation Richard Honeywood ended up making, which would ironically end up being repeated in later games, as the word is Ouroboros, which itself is the symbol of a snake eating its own tail, representing a cycle of life that exists in perpetuity. The tail the Ouroboros certain eats sustains its life, allowing it to grow, and grow its tail back, providing it more sustenance. It is one of the largest tenets in Gnosticism, representing a unity in all things, that materiality and spirituality exist as one large, interconnected, unbreakable, complete system. It is also a sword in .hack GU last recode that I constructed a 1-1 scale prop of in 2018, and have had it on my set ever since. In Xenogears' case, the Ouroboros represents what I've discussed before, the wave existence calling back Fay and Ellie's souls from beyond death to be reborn in life until they can break its prison. Their cycle of existence through their lives unbroken until they make contact once more with the Zohar to sever their connection and allow the wave existence to be freed. This acting for Krelian as the evidence that Ellie is the one he's been searching for, Sophia's reincarnation that has been touched by their god, and the Ouroboros ring the key to realizing them as his desire. As if he can physically manifest the power of the Ouroboros ring, he will create his god. He will be very disappointed. However, as things reach their climax, Satan cuts the power to the cells and Krelian's lab, allowing Satan to speak freely. As it turns out, Satan is Cain's agent. As said before, Cain has been working in secret to bring down his own ministry, having realized after the war half a millennia ago that he was serving the wrong master. Every human on the planet has been implanted by ethos with a limiter that prevents them from directly acting against the Gazelle ministry and Cain himself. Satan having brought them all here, as Krelian's research lab is the only place on the entire planet where they could be removed as he invented them in the first place. Satan's position as Cain's secret hand is what allowed them here, so now there are no chains anymore that will hold them back from ending their reign. Ellie, however, was not implanted with a limiter, because of Miang's intervention on the matter. We rescue her from Krelian's lab to escape after destroying the last barrier generator, only to be stopped by Ramsus, who has just devolved as a character into being a raving lunatic in anger and jealousy towards Fay, and his continued inability to match up to a damaged individual. Which, while it's not out of nowhere, remember all the stuff I've discussed before about Ramsus' character, is not very even in that devolution of character into this state, as beyond the stuff with his introduction, he's only really dogged us throughout the game as a mid-boss that keeps coming after us without much in the way of context as to why, beyond being Miang's unaware lapdog. That doesn't allow us to see much of his consequential breakdown to make him be all driven by rage like this and abandon all that made him, well, him. Like, when N has his psychotic breakdown in Xenoblade 3, and I cannot get into more information on that because spoilers, it's when the entire foundation of his existence has been stripped away from him. The character sacrificed everything for his goal, which twisted him into a shell of a man to preserve the one thing that was his, even as his actions drove that thing away from him. When Amalthus in Xenoblade 2 does his thing, again, can't get into it because spoilers, it's at the point where he's nearing his goal, so has no more need for the facade he disguises himself with, so he can freely show his malice by which to direct it towards those who are blocking his way to his goal. Ramsus? From what's here? Not so much, as so little time has been spent on him beyond the abstract that it really doesn't justify the breakdown. Like, you want to know how long it's been since he was relevant at any point? Over 12 hours since he was last referenced at all. The most he's been seen doing is deploying his element minions, and the most he's been mentioned is with the Ministry lambasting him for his constant failures. And his failures are not cited as why he's been going nuts. So it turns out Hammer, the merchant that's been with us since Kislev, has also somehow managed to rescue Ellie's parents from lockup, them intending to escape from Solaris with us now that the last generator's destroyed, so the Kislev, Ava, and Shivat forces can finally strike back at their oppressors. But Hammer is here, as Krelian has bribed him with a promise of power if he can prevent Ellie from escaping the city, having felt less and less of value as the storyline has moved on, and he's only just provided supplies and information without really fighting himself. Logistics and resources are important for supporting a war, after all, so him feeling worthless for playing his role, that doesn't really work, as it's the same job he's always done. Hell, him supplying the resistance directly makes him more important, so becoming a bit player to echo his own view? Yeah, it doesn't work. Hell, it works even less for me, as before he popped up in this stage, I had not seen, or at least I don't remember seeing him, since he was interned in Kislev as he was that irrelevant. Apparently he was on the ship, but I never actually bought anything from him.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
Ellie's mom intervenes in this attempted kidnapping, ultimately coming to be shot by Hammer, leaving Ellie distraught, which is where Graf comes in, once more challenging Fay and demanding Ellie stay in Solaris as well. Ellie's dad sacrifices himself in a gear to give him a chance to escape as well, only for Graf's ally in this fight, the Executioner, to attack the entire party and paralyze them, angering Fay to the point that Id emerges, calling the Weltall to him, and ultimately giving Graf what he wanted. While the Cybs then evacuates everyone else, Id goes wild on the Solaris superstructure, ultimately destroying the entire nation and sending it plummeting to the surface. Id is out of control at this point, Ellie believing only she can calm him down, as she somehow knows that Fay won't allow Id to harm her, her efforts ultimately succeeding. The team reconvene in Shivat, Satan finally coming clean about what's up with Fay regarding his dissociative identity disorder and nature as the contact, and how Cain has pursued him throughout time on order of Deus. Deus selling the lie to his puppet that Fay's incarnations were an enemy to man, but his incarnation of Fay having disproven such to Cain's satisfaction thanks to Satan's reports, after Cain's original resolve was shaken the last time Fay incarnated back as Lacan. Admittedly, that's a bit disproven considering Id just massacred the entire population of Solaris, but by this point even Cain acknowledged how broken his society was. The problem, however, is that every time Id awakens, the line between the Fay we know and Id himself is breaking down, allowing Id more control and existence in the world again. And Id is, well, still completely mad and reactionary, and being egged on by Graf to manifest. Shavat also knows of Graf from the last war and the scourge that Persona has been on the world and its hosts. Zephyr fearing it so badly, she wants to steal Fay entirely away to prevent his id side from being used as a weapon by Graf against everyone, considering the immense power it has shown. Intending to seal him in carbonite? I have no idea if that was a deliberate Star Wars reference or not. But as Jesse points out, Graf, Miang, and Krelian's activities have been devastating the planet for centuries independent of Solaris' activities. Hell, the incident Ramsus blames Fay for? That was Solaris testing Id after they created the persona. And yet, because of how Id had been used and his manifestations had been triggered, it goes back to what I said in the first video. The story is constantly scapegoating Fay for other people's actions. Rico even bringing up a bunch of his friends dying back in Kislev, but when the fuck did that happen? Wasn't that the monster they fought and not it at all? Did I turn over 2 pages at once here, or did I miss a scene of that happening? Legitimately, something is missing here, and I don't know if it's something I missed in playing this game, or if it's another thing that was removed from it. But because all this guilt has been misplaced on Fay, he's all on board the lot of them sealing him away. Which would be noble, except for one thing.
We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Yeah, they've tried nothing to resolve the id issue, such as, say, therapy? We've got all this psychologically altering tech and treatments, why not try and awaken id in a way where they can reason with it? Satan's had decent luck trying it can clearly be done. So, Fay instead saying, do it, with context to how they keep shoving everything onto him? Yeah, it doesn't work, as it's just him giving in to the misplaced guilt and accepting the blame and consequences, which, as has been discussed before, does not resolve the actual problems as it leaves those actually responsible for why things are wrong off scot-free to continue doing wrong. Ellie in turn refuses to let them do that, breaking Fay out and escaping with him, have their party apologizing before they leave for even considering Fay dangerous, which is to their benefit. Though them leaving in turn leaves them an open target for Ramsus once more, who has been given an Anima relic that upgrades his gear into an Omni gear, given orders from Krelian to abduct Ellie for him in exchange for it, and a chance to take down Fay once and for all. And we don't even get a chance to fight back. This is just one long cutscene of Ramsus' new Omni gear utterly destroying the Weltall, not even bothering to abduct Ellie, who ends up mortally wounded in the crash. Ultimately, finally, ending Disc 1. And this is where the dev team ran out of development time for the game, and you begin to understand why they absolutely could not end the game here on such a cliffhanger, even with several levels partially done and just missing the fleshed out story segments for the content around them programmed in, alongside, honestly, what they actually needed with the game, and a second draft with a lot of the text and storyline. And consequently, this is where we hit the mass recap of the remaining story that makes up the grand majority of Disc 2. And you know what? Had the story gotten a second pass through to not make it as poorly told as it is, there is a lot of cool stuff that would have been featured in this game had this side been fully completed. But we're over 60 hours into this game at this point, It should not take 60 hours into a game for it to get good or engaging. I've been sold on Persona games in the first few hours of them, even though Persona 5 has a long introductory month to it. Dot Hack hooked me by the end of its first explorable area in both mainline games. Zone of the Enders had me squeeing the first time I was in combat. Final Fantasy X had me intrigued at the point their first major cutscenes had happened, as did 7 by the time I came into Cloud doing a solid for Tifa at her bar. And the later Xenoblade games had me sold by the point that each of the numbered games' protagonists began interacting with their paramours. It should not have taken until the game hit Recap City to actually become entertaining to me. And it is very telling how jagged this recap is. Just going to narration from the perspective of Fay and Ellie, that's formatted in the form of as if we just came in new to the story. But it is, once again, all delivered in purple prose that, as said before, is not a good means by which to give actual exposition to the audience. These segments then intersect with what was done for the game in its second half, but begin to speed past varied story points to resolve the conflict in a hyper-accelerated way. Ellie and Fay crash near the research outpost of a very old man who has somehow found nanotechnology that healed Ellie and Fay, which can also be spread around the planet to disable those same limiter seals Solaris put on every living being they could to prevent uprisings against the Gazelle Ministry. Which begs the question of why Satan didn't just bring them here for that, since Satan knows the researcher here. And this researcher instantaneously fixed the id problem, while giving the Woltal an upgrade. Solaris' remnants try and interrupt a peace treaty between the factions, leading to Fay and Ellie using the new Woltal to thwart their scheme, with the new Woltal basically one-punch-manning Ramsus' Omni gear in turn. They take these nanites and put them into a mass driver facility that still existed from the time of the Zeboim people that was Fay's Kim incarnation that created Emeralda, which shoots these nanites into the upper atmosphere, and the rebellion consequently begins with no one no longer slave to the Ministry, likewise resetting the mentality of the Solaris survivors to something resembling how they should be without being drugged. Solaris then unleashes a terrestrial destruction weapon that looks like the version of Ramiel that is depicted in the rebuild of Evangelion movies, because of course Hideaki Anno would probably be a fan of this game. I'm not saying he took the idea of this thing, just that he's the kind of mecha otaku who would have likely engaged with this game after its release, depending on his own mindset. Could also be a coincidence. To counter this, however, we return to Kislev to plug the Yggdrasil into the main command center of the city, revealing that the entire capital is built around a giant battleship that the Yggdrasil-class vessels were all designed to plug into. Say it with me, kids! Transform and combine! Why the fuck are we not allowed to keep this literal walking Macross reference with us the rest of the frickin' game? But with the defeat of Solaris, a plague then struck everyone on the planet. Carried by a nanomachine virus Krelian created thanks to his research of Emeralda's nanites, causing mass mutations of families and villages into monsters. Though the heroes mistakenly believed this to be a consequence of the limiter seals being removed by the nanites. This is also the Ministry, Miang and Krelian, can accelerate the timetable of their scheme to resurrect Deus, not caring if they have to bioform every person on the planet now to generate the biomass they need to give Deus a new form, as inevitably this virus will transform every person on the planet, as they are inevitably drawn to various Soylent System centers dropped all over the planet. The people thinking they're secret refuges from this calamity enter them, only to be eaten by the wells and that biomass then transformed into even larger gear-scale wells, used to spread the disease even farther, while devastating the chances that gears can protect the remaining survivors. While the crew eventually destroy all the Soylent System facilities, the waves of wells they've unleashed are an unrelenting tide against everyone that's left. As the Gazelle Ministry prepare to awaken Deus, Cain openly opposing them now to stop them from doing so, the rest of the party look into any records they can find of the remaining Anima relic artifacts to upgrade more of their units into Omni gears. However, only 2 dungeons for discovering those were programmed before the game hit its deadline, so it doesn't exactly feel like an epic quest to find the ones that aren't already activated. 4 of which said on the wikis to have never been seen, which is sourced from one of the Apocrypha books, another 3 used by Miang, Ramsus, and Krelian, 1 just reclaimed by Satan in his mech the Fenrir, the Andvari, the Alpha Welltail, and the Shavat gear Ellie later takes named the El-Regurus, leaving just 2 unactivated Anima relics left, which end up installed in Billy and Rico's gears after we retrieve them from the 2 Anima dungeons that are playable. There are supposedly 12 of them, all of the Anima relics named after the children of the religious figure Jacob from the Hebrew Bible, but by count in the game, there are 13 thanks to those 4 lost units that have pre-existing alignments, unless one of those is being miscounted as they were aligned 500 years ago, meaning one of those lost 4 could possibly be either Krelian or Miang's Omni gears, and the text just made it less clear on what that was about. You also might recall me calling the Cybzen an Anima relic-powered robot as well, meaning it should be an Omni gear too. And again, it was supposed to be, but due to the story compression that's going on here, that got cut too, despite the Anima relic stuff only really appearing in the game around the point the Cybzen is introduced, which makes this once more a story versus lore contradiction. My rationalization with this one, though, is the Cybzen is still being powered by a relic, but it isn't properly aligned like the others are, so it's not as functional, or it's a translation error that wasn't caught and the Cybzen is just supposed to be on the power tier of an Omni gear without actually having an Anima relic in it. Either one is equally plausible. The first of these 2 dungeons has us once more come into conflict with Ramsus' Elements team, which have some new weapons to show us, alongside some really, really terrible dialogue that I don't know whether to blame on the game script or not. But regardless... This is legitimately the only time I think I can name an enemy mech that uses that lion torso armor, as that's usually a staple to heroic mechs from, say, the Brave series or Super Sentai. Gao was airing at the time this game released. I wonder at what point in development this mech was planned. The second Anima Relic quest comes after an extended round of cutscenes that finally give up everything I've said about Ramsus being a clone of Cain, intended to be a replacement contact to try and explain his character devolution. But again, when you know what his deal is in advance, this sanity slippage that happens with him actually becomes less tolerable for those reasons, especially since the abuse the Ministry heaps on him, he in turn sends onto his subordinates that all followed him because they thought he was a better leader than Cain or the Ministry, when in reality it was all a self-affirming ego trip for him. Like, to do another compare-contrast, Sakaki from .hack.gu. He pulls off this turn from seemingly cultured peacekeeper secretly acting insurgent to his guild leader as a sycophantic egomaniac into a complete loon, and it works because we can tell this arrogant dipshit is actively in the wrong all game long. GU's writer Tatsuya Hamazaki spent 2 whole entries lampshading how monstrous Sakaki was, and keeping in our minds how awful he was by proxy of main character Adelie, and how Sakaki's doctrines and actions towards her were strangling the girl who already had suicidally low self-esteem. Thus, since we had someone close to the cast who was being negatively affected by his ego trip, and constantly reminded of his machinations, his breakdown into an openly power-seeking abusive lunatic in the back half of the storyline fit and made sense as it was still cohesive to the entirety of his presented character. Ramsus, meanwhile, has not gotten the same, and that was even before we hit Recap City on the guy's plot. There's just so many things said about him and how he built his power base, but we do not see that reflected in his own personal actions and mannerisms, as it really doesn't feel like he's a Machiavellian mastermind that can use a high charisma score to do this and get the recruits he has. It's like he's Mordred demanding the throne from King Arthur after being egged on to do so by Morgan Le Fay. They're not going to give it up, and you look like a petulant, whiny child for doing so, as you haven't done things of merit to earn it. This is, of course, disregarding all the discontent of Arthur as king associated with that legend, which resulted in the following civil conflict. And that is shown by when he attacks Nassan in everyone but Ellie's absence, that his minions finally abandon him, as it's shown how small of an impudent child he is. Though as I think more on what I just said, the Mordred comparison is an apt one, considering Miang is there playing her part as the Morgan Le Fay, leading him along to do what she wants him to, as it's more and more shown in this side of the story that Miang is the mastermind behind everything, manipulating everyone, including pulling the strings of the Ministry. For Miang is actually Ellie's counterpart to Graf, a spirit incarnation of Ellie as the antitype, serving Deus's whims, after being created by Deus himself, and riding this cycle of reincarnation as well as a parasite in the way Graf does. So the woman Ramsus fell in love with that allows Miang to manipulate him, yeah, she really originally was someone that loved him, but when Miang awoke within her, that's when everything became twisted. Then as said, we hit the Anima dungeon for the last relic to give it to Rico's units, where we have a confrontation with a new breed of well-gear hybrid, the one we face being an utter monster controlled by Hammer. And I just killed with Ellie's erods in justice for Hammer getting Ellie's parents killed. Yeah, this exchange is supposed to be Rico's big damn closure moment, but Hammer really didn't have much in the way of a connection to Rico back in Kislev to serve as the basis for that. At best, they roomed together on the Yggdrasil. Though again, I could be missing something here. It's just from everything I was able to see, they did not seem that close to make this Rico story closure point. From here, Ramsus confronts Cain, Krelian with him to exposit on Ramsus' original purpose in being Cain's executioner and replacement. Ramsus succeeding in such, and still past that, not getting what he wanted. The Ministry uses this death as their sign to use the key they have to awaken Deus, which hyper-accelerates the well's mutation across the planet, and calling to the surface the structure the Ministry calls Mahanan, a misspelling of Machanan, the fourth heaven, aka the heaven where the biblical Eden resides, which is really the remaining main body of the Eldridge that houses Deus. Okay, the ship broke up across the planet. How is there enough of the damn thing left to still not only have power and function, but be structurally intact enough that it has any form of propulsion to raise itself out from beneath the sea after 10,000 years?
Tough little ship. Little?
This is a completely unplayable stage this time, only included because the assault against it causes a divide between Ellie and Fay, him not wanting her to join the battle, and her wanting to stay, as even with the Omni-Gears, she's still a force to be reckoned with her erods. So Fay's being stupid. His stupidity on the matter primarily being motivated by the memories of his past life as Lacan, where Sophia did join the battle on Shavad's side against Solaris, and died because of it, which in turn spawned Graph. Not wanting history to repeat itself? Fair. The way Fay goes about it, though? That makes him the asshole in this situation, for the sole reason of continuing the scapegoating of the character later. But once more, since this game was in the 90s, this is a situation that Ellie is forced to accept because good old-fashioned Japanese sexism, where the woman has to wait at home for the hero's return, despite the hero's party involving a little girl and his AI nanite daughter, which is a fact completely forgotten in this entire plot line. It's at this point the hero faction learn all about the Eldridge, the floating hull ultimately exposing them to the rotted, damaged corpse of Deus, that isn't much of a corpse at this moment anymore, resulting in a battle against the damaged husk. From there, we enter the computer core of the ship that allows them to learn the true nature of their god, which I can't actually read a word of because of everything behind the text is so bright the actual text entirely bleeds into it. Seriously, game designers and subtitle writers, especially for import games, a black border around any text you put on screen is a fucking requirement to have any important story text be legible to the audience. It has been 25 years since Xenogears released. How the fuck is this still a regular failing that lasts to this day? Bottom line of all of this, while we destroyed Deus' original body, it has already transferred its main systems out of it, and is constructing a new one that will be made from the amalgamation of all the wells. Thus why that plan has been in motion all game, and it can escape the planet in an interplanetary assault ship that was part of the Deus system, which the Eldridge also had aboard it, called the Merkabah. And again, I must ask, if Deus was disabled before the Eldridge launched, then why were not just the components of Deus, but all of its support equipment shipped with the survivors of its rampancy? This is the kind of thing where you want to separate those pieces for complete decommissioning, not make it so some idiot or terrorist, if they wanted to, could instantly do so by stealing all the parts at once, let alone the malicious AI itself. When you go up to the interplanetary scale on such a thing, then the farther separated those things are, the better, lest they be reassembled eventually if they're all on hand. Krelian attacks everyone, Graf using this to draw Ellie out of hiding, as at this point endangering Ellie will bring out Id, who hasn't appeared since the Psyche suppressor that was installed at the beginning of Disc 2 became active. But this in turn shows why insisting on doing things this way, even in this story recap, was pointless, as literally 5 minutes ago, Ellie was telling Fay it was a bad idea to split the party and leave her behind. And thus, it has been. Ellie getting a feeling that the others are in danger, and consequently recovering her past incarnation Sophia's Omni gear, the El-Regurus, which only exists as a unit in these cutscenes here. Well, I tell a partial lie with that. If, once the game lets you have free control again, you go back to Kislev and go to the gear battle arenas, you can select the El-Regurus as a unit to play as, but that's about it. It doesn't ever end up used as a party unit, because Ellie is no longer a party member for the rest of the game, but instead the damsel that serves as Fay's primary motivation to do, well, anything. And that's not a nice look for either of them, considering she's one of the 3 party members that have shown a consistent capacity to actually do shit. And before this, was a career soldier, so didn't need to be treated like an invalid. So because Fay was an idiot, Ellie's forced to fight Miang and Krelian alone, as the rest of the Omni Gears are shown crucified on a battlefield? Okay, I need to put this in context, as most people would not get it. And in fact, when I talked to this with other Xenoblade fans, they didn't get it entirely, as they didn't realize this was a reference. And that reference is, much like Hideaki Anno, Tetsuya Takahashi is a huge dork for Ultraman and the Ultra franchise as a whole. He is such a dork for them that the blades in Xenoblade 2, yeah, they were originally meant to be giant in homage, referencing the Ultras as a combat battle mechanic. The problem with doing that is they couldn't figure out how to get this game mechanics for that to work right, especially not with the idea of giant woman Pyra and Mithra, so that ended up mostly scrapped, until they eventually figured out how to utilize the mechanic correctly in Xenoblade 3 for their interleg party mechanic. But that explains this scene, because the giant crucifixion, yeah, that is from a rather memorable episode of Ultraman Ace, called The Crucifixion of the Ultra Brothers. Yes, seriously. The then-existent Ultraman, in a crossover event, explore a planet that mysteriously had appeared out of nowhere, which is named Golgotha, which is a trap set by the alien antagonist of Ace, Yapul, who has a hate boner for the entire Ultra species, and frequently orchestrates schemes to torture and exterminate them. Ergo, the Crucifixion. Incidentally, Yapul was the first series-long antagonist for an Ultraman entry, so he's made a lot of subsequent appearances in later media, as he keeps trying to pull the same stuff. But yeah, that is the context to why the mechs are strung up like this, as it's calling upon the same thematic iconography that the Ultraman Ace episode did, with these individuals caught up in the midst of an eternal, unending grudge that even death cannot sate and end. It has jack shit to do with Christianity as many believe it to, and is in fact just another example of Japanese media making a deep-cut reference to a 1970s tokusatsu show that the creator of the story has a deep fondness for as they grew up with it. Because as with near everything in Japanese media, it will inevitably in some way, shape, or form break down to being a toku reference, if not a classic robot reference. Ellie inevitably devastates the monsters Krelian sends after her, defeating them while endangering her life, seeming to confirm completely for Krelian beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ellie is Sophia's reincarnation, and the mother required for Deus' resurrection as the other half of Miang, from which their true god will be reborn. That sounds extremely rapey. Then again, the entire plot around Deus' resurrection seems to be echoing Xenomorphs and the Alien franchise in some respects to how wells have been spawning from people in this sect of the game. Granted, at this point, Krelian's gotten everything he wanted that he could not achieve on his own, so pulls the plug on the Gazelle ministry entirely, having no further use for them in his plot to create a true god.
False god. Dead false god.
Fay wallows in self-pity, Cain and his wise men guys appearing to tell him how badly he screwed up. Again, the story pretty much forcing him to make a choice that doesn't make sense as the character has no pride to begin with, which is cited as here as why he did it. Made worse is in how throughout the entire game, it's made to seem as if Fay has learned nothing from anything he's gone through to grow as a person. And you know what? Fair enough. The last time we had any level of tangible growth from the guy was back when we were just about to infiltrate Ava over 50 hours ago. But to have a character stuck in stagnation that long is not a sign of a competent story to begin with if he's learned nothing from his various experiences. This condescension is likewise not enjoyable for me, as while I agree with it, it's something that's only true because of external plot-generated reasons, and not from what would feel as natural developments from Fay coming to step up as the storyline keeps trying to insist he does. So is he growing up and being responsible, or is he not? You can't have it both ways. Yet the plot keeps attempting to do so with its depiction of his screw-ups. The idea with this is pretty much the inference that Fay cannot keep running from his inevitable confrontation with Id, but it is really poorly handled as every time the game brings up one of Fay's deficiencies, it makes it about things either outside of his control, or features a trait that a previous one of these conversations said was a bad thing for Fay to rely on, but putting a good spin on it. Fay must control his emotions, because emotions are a weakness and lead him to giving into id, and then that's said in this conversation as them being Graf's strength. You must be separate from those you care about lest you endanger them, that's why he tried to have Ellie stay behind. And then this failure is from Fay doing that exact thing others insisted he learn to do. It is circular logic where Fay cannot ever win. Not because he's legitimately in the wrong in every single situation, but because the story is deliberately making him wrong regardless of what he does, and force him to make the worst decision he can with no control. It's like, what does the story want at this point? For us to like the guy, or constantly condemn him? We enter the Merkabah in an attempt to stop Krelian's plan. Both Ramsus and Miang once more stopping us and elaborating on his backstory again of an intended replacement for both Cain and Fay, and them existing preventing his purpose for existing, and he's angry about all of that, when he just cannot understand the most simple of concepts and how he has been used and abused by Miang and Krelian for their own needs. And his whining about it has just gotten fucking old, as it's been the same fucking thing from him without change for over 30 freaking hours now. We kick his ass and we're allowed to the confrontation with Miang, whose mech has been upgraded with self-repair nanomachines that prevent us doing easy damage to her. Her unit stalling us until the story event causes Deus' new maturation cocoon to begin to swallow the mechs whole in order to restore power to itself via the Zohar power the Anima relics themselves draw from. So us recovering all of the Anima relics to gain the power of the Omni gears? Yeah, that was actually a bad thing. As with Miang as the antitype of Deus, her recombining with the true mother side of her existence and being powered by the Anima relics, well, the destined resurrection of this monster is now at hand. Well, I guess we're going to throw that into the oops category. After all, they'd already recovered all the relics before they learned of the information from the ship, so it's not like they could have known that would happen. Though this one feels like one where you should legitimately blame Fay for how bad it goes, as if Ellie hadn't taken the Omni gear from Shavat, this lot would have never gotten their hands on it to take that relic from it either to feed the new Deus. Thus, again, am I supposed to be on his side or not with the railroading that's going on with him? Ramsus intercedes on this, finally asking his creators, the ones he should have hated all this time, well, What even was his purpose?
What is my purpose?
To wait until I tell you to pull the lever.
You are fucking kidding me.
I'm not even kidding with that joke clip. His existence is for the sole purpose of doing what his parents tell him to, regardless of what that does to him. And they can just play him like a fiddle, even when they're telling him the truth. Case in point on that, to recombine with Ellie, Miang needs to have her current existence die. And in telling Ramsus the truth, she gets her wish, allowing her to possess Ellie and fuse back with her other self, leaving behind the prior host of her consciousness, who had started out as Ramsus's lover. As for Ellie... yeah, she's been saving up that stress for a while. Real foreshadowing for her to finally shoot him in the final act. No, this is Miang's attempt to finally rid herself of the contact and its chances to intervene in Deus' resurrection, as Fay is not needed anymore. She explains the entire plot of the game again for those who have not gotten it yet. Even Deus creating the humans of the world to be used as spare parts for its own repairs, of which there were not enough to actually restore Deus, thanks to the Gazelle Ministry's own stupidity with the Soylent system. And Miang's own efforts to literally kill every single freaking thing on the planet that kept culling the population that needed to be used for this purpose, that was purportedly their ultimate end goal. Bit of a fundamental defect in their overall scheme is what I'm saying, since they kept trying to fucking kill every pound of flesh that ended up needed for this.
Yes, there was a little collateral damage, probably not important.
To make up the difference, well, that was why Emeralda's nanites were needed once again, to permit Deus to reconnect with the biological matter synthesizer that originally created Miang, Cain, and the Gazelle Ministry, which had been decoupled from Deus long before the crash happened, that device independently spawning them as we saw at the beginning of the game. With these revelations, the heroes are ejected from the Merkabah as it rises to the surface itself, and consequently devastating the entire planet. The game takes another detour to explore more of its backstory regarding the Shavat Solaris War to try and explain Graf's origins regarding his existence as Lacan, and their connection to Sophia and Krelian, and how Sophia's eventual death in the war devastated them after she was used as a tool by Shavat. But it's way, way too late for that, and not just because they're summarizing what Xenogears 4 would have been about, especially as the story really should be focused in this moment on everything dealing with Deus, and obtaining the means by which to route them, which this really doesn't logically do. At best, it acts as another shot to Fay figuring out, thanks to his past memories, where the Zohar is. Id taking control of him and hijacking the Weltall. Its own contact with the Zohar, changing it into some massive embryonic dragon just to contain the immense power it is directly tapping. Its body left catatonic, as the wave existence in the Zohar can sense the consciousness of its contact. But with that soul splintered as it is, it can't exactly determine intent from Fay. Sensing the others, this thing attacks, leading to another boss battle with Id. Cain once more interceding as wise man to try and talk sense to his son, as this transformation was not supposed to happen yet. And Cain's big plan to get Fay over his dissociative identity disorder in order to take Graf back as well? Yeah, thanks to all the scapegoating the game's done, that blew up in their faces, and it is now stronger than ever, as it gains power from resentment. And frankly, everything Id is angry about that makes him lash out, they're surprisingly logical, at least far more than Ramsus's were, as he felt abandoned by Cain when he was being experimented on as a child. And yet it's shown that this time, Id is not in control. Fay deliberately let Id have control, so Fay could finally feel and remember everything about Id and his experiences that Fay could not, to actually do the job of reunifying himself by confronting the truth about his mother and her death, tied to when Miang possessed her and tried to use Fay to speed along Deus' awakening thanks to his powers as the contact. The trauma from all that causing the split personalities in the first place, and the awakening of the contact powers calling Graf to them. Where in the conflict, Id subsequently killed Miang's incarnation as Fay's mom, with the release of his power, and devastated Graf enough so it was forced to possess Cain himself, as the fractured personas prevented Graf from the same reunification, and causing the extreme divide of Fay and Id seen all game as consequence of their guilt. But Fay, learning of this, and seeing more of his past lives' memories where Ellie keeps dying in his arms, it snaps him out of it. Gaining the resolve the game has insisted he lacks all storyline long, in seeking now to truly save her, accepting Id as part of himself as he needs his other self's power to achieve that, and make up for the memories it had been saddled with, where it's all been nothing but memories of pain. This extended contact with the Zohar, however, allows Fay to communicate at last with the wave existence in the Zohar, which tells him of its imprisonment in it, and at this point, this entity having come to understand four-dimensional existence enough to communicate with humans clearly enough to understand. The importance of ending this cycle, now that Fay is nearly complete once more being presented, and the Waltall evolved into the titular Xenogears of the game, which in turn leads to the final confrontation with Graf as he emerges once more from within Cain, eager to at last commune once again with his true self, to gain the power to destroy the world, and Deus with it to end its scheme, without remorse for the lives that would be lost. And consequently, the strength and power of the Xenogear makes it impossible for Graf to gain that advantage. Though what happens next is off. The Zohar trying to swallow Fay and Graf simultaneously because they were the first original component of the Deus system and it wants to make contact with everything in that test again? No. No, they weren't. This is that thing where the storyline and the lore material are at cross purposes with one another, as Fay's original incarnation of Abel was not part of the Deus system. It made contact with it while the Deus system was being tested and is not part of it. Moreover, we just had a long talk with the wave existence trapped in the Zohar to know what it wants. It wants us to go off and destroy Deus, so everything drawing power from it is cut off from it, which would allow it to leave. This is not that task. It's ultimately a Deus Ex Machina, to kill Graf and get him finally out of the story. Him saying that him joining with the Zohar will be the closest he'll ever get to reunifying with Fay now. Which just leaves the group free to formulate a plan of attack against the Merkabah, using the last remaining warship Shabbat has from their prior conflict as a ride sled for the Yggdrasil 4 to get past the Merkabah's main cannon. The warship they ride in destroyed, and them turning its bow into a blade as consequence. The Yggdrasil 4 destroyed in the subsequent explosions as the Merkabah goes up. The Merkabah scuttled entirely before Deus can use it to leave the planet. Unfortunately, Deus has drawn enough power from the Zohar to just say, screw it, it'll convert the whole planet into its new vessel. It is at this point that the game finally becomes playable again, allowing players to hunt down actual endgame items that are left. And there really aren't that many. Sure, you can hunt down some new accessories from the Murder of Wells. There's a bunch of side quests that can be done for last-minute super weapons, such as the Kijin sword for Satan and his gear. Hell, there's even a quest down to more of the Zeboim ruins to allow Emeralda to grow up into a big girl by permitting her to fuse with another nanite colony that was created by Fay's Kim incarnation that gives you a lot of additional scenes of that era because, well, let's face it, I think they caught on by now that this was not going to allow them to end up doing a Xenogears 1 through 4 to fill in stories of these prior civilizations and conflicts. And as you can probably have been able to tell from my tone of voice in the recap by this point, I was beyond tired with this game by myself at this point. As I've said before, when all of the previous 10 hours of cutscenes finally end, it takes a good 5 hours of grinding with all these quests tacked on to be ready to go and confront Deus one last time. Its internals leading into its central core, one massive labyrinth that, in my absolute irritation with things by this point, the guidebook gives no hints as to a means by which to get through them. Yeah, I've not been getting into it, but this thing is fucking worthless. I usually expect better of Brady Games' strategy guides from all the ones of theirs I've owned over the years, but it really feels like between the story fatigue and how basic everything but the time sinks are, that author Ron Wartow couldn't feel like being bothered in explaining how to get through stuff like this, or provide maps or citations of how to do crap, which is what you look for a guide in the first freaking place. I looked up the other strategy guides he's written, and yeah, they're somehow worse than this. Look up his Final Fantasy VII guidebook to laugh at how much worse it is than the official one Brady Games did for that game the previous year. It's like night and day. And looking up Xenogears guides online, yeah, I can actually believe it took almost 5 years after this game released for anyone to actually complete a halfway competent guide for this game. Though credit and shout out to GameFAQs guide creator Shotgun Nova, who has continued to update and improve his guide of Xenogears through as recently as 2020, even having fully mapped out every part of the game. It's his stuff that I reference whenever I get lost, and the guy has written no less than 36 of the highest rated game guides that are hosted on that site, including the best text guides for Final Fantasies 9 and 10 and Mass Effects 1 and 2. That's impressive for any one person. But yeah, it takes me like 3 hours to deep dive everything Deus has as an internal defense on its body, even with that guide, due to how strong stuff is down here, and the paths of travel being all sorts of messed up, so you end up having to solve a series of platform and tunnel puzzles which are so demanding that even looking at the GameFAQs guide again and reviewing the footage, I cannot make sense of how I actually go through it, nor can figure out how others would do so blind. But even after all that, we run into another complication, as Deus' core is drawing power from 4 other power cores that are made up of the interim Anima relics that got sucked out of our Omni gears about 9 hours ago. What time is it? These preliminary bosses are a pain, as it's unlikely to know which one you'll get, and they all have different rules to them which makes them extremely hard even with a properly leveled and outfitted team. But you want to defeat them first, as each of them controls a central system of Deus that you want it to not have, such as his super powerful finishing moves, self-healing, and the ability to drain our fuel. No, instead these sub-bosses have those abilities to exploit and crush our party with themselves. And thanks to the dimensions of the room they're in, it is very easy to run into one of them by accident while you're trying to fix your party up between battles, or swap the members around as they become too damaged or resource-starved to battle, or be viable against Deus once you're done with them. The irony being that any version of Deus you fight, if you've destroyed all 4 of these cores, actually has less health than any of these guardians individually does. If you do manage to take out the Heralds of Divinity in this case, Deus himself is a much more manageable deity to kill, especially with a team of Bart, Fay, and Satan as I went at with him, as if you charge your attack levels to max, the weakened Deus goes down far, far faster. With Deus dead, all power coming from the Zohar is instantly cut off, leaving Fay to rescue Ellie from within the core of the corpse. Only as said, with power no longer being pulled from the Zohar, the wave existence wants out, and is building up its power to escape, which will take the entire planet with it. Ellie, having regained control of herself with Deus dead, uses her connection to Deus' mainframe to rip the structure out of the planet and fling it into space to avoid the worst. But the explosion that's coming will just be too big for that to make a difference. Fay using the Xenogear that's powered by his abilities as the contact at this point to try and suppress it and break the wave existence's prison himself to stop it. Which is where Krelian comes in again, having turned himself into a nanite colony to be one with Deus before, and thus has survived Deus' demise. He rips Miang out of Ellie's incarnation, and turns her into a manifestation of the Ouroboros serpent to challenge Fay to the right to Ellie's love, prettying up the fight with some existential bullshit about fate and determination. But frankly, this all rings hollow considering he's been a manipulative jackass the entire game. So he doesn't have the right to preach about fate versus self-determination, as it all comes off as just freaking pretentious. Which is kind of what we expect from this guy who refused to take no for an answer and refused to understand that the girl he liked just was not into him. It is impossible to lose this fight at this point, however. I'm literally doing the max damage per hit on Miang, meaning this fight is over in literal seconds, so I don't even know what the purpose of this was outside of ego. Ellie, upon her rescue and awakening, tries to frame all of Krelian's actions as him doing this all for humanity's sake, but yeah, that does not connect like that at all, in my opinion. As much as I dislike Xenosaga 3 when it tries to pull the same crap, it actually better succeeds at it because, by that point in its story, its cast had evolved into being assholes. So the villain with their execution of this "I shall save humanity by destroying it" plot came off as far more valid. Krelian? He's a jilted ex-lover that never got over the girl he liked, and that doesn't excuse his unrepentant massacre of so many just to resurrect the corpse of a false god. To not even say how this suddenly tries to shift the blame over how Ellie, through her incarnations, kept appearing to sacrifice herself for Fay's incarnations, which would only appear to escalate the cycle of tragedy. Like, I've said enough about how irritated I was about the game constantly scapegoating Fay, but it was legitimately worse when it would try to blame the horrible actions people take independently of one another on those who would not condone those acts, as if what was done to them was the excuse others chose to become terrible people, when it was still their choice to commit atrocities. Said it before, I'll say it again. You have to hold accountable those who start this crap, as otherwise they'll just keep doing it. And I think the mass genocide that was committed in this game for good reasons is a clear example of that, as Krelian never suffers the consequences. He gets to go off with the wave existence into fifth dimensional space to now serve his true god. Though considering higher order entities in fiction tend to be the kinds of horrors that make up Lovecraft, I hope he descends into babbling insanity once he realizes how much of an ant he is. But yeah, we're at the happy ending part of the game. The wave existence returning to Fay and Ellie their mortality and severing their cycle of reincarnation, returning them to the surface to rejoin with their friends on a planet that has been reduced to a barren wasteland. Yeah, good luck surviving with that. Xenogears is a highly ambitious game, one hamstrung by the development limitations of the console it was on, the anachronistic design it was created with, the ability to convey the ideas it was presenting, the lacking consistency of this lore, the reality of the game not being allowed to be completed properly, which might have worked to amend some of the problems of it if it had got a chance to second draft some of these ideas, and the fact that, quite frankly, it's so boring. I genuinely struggled at many points to best convey my feelings about this game and its various story points, but I do feel this is a case where other games of its era and ones not that long past it would better idealize what it was attempting to do, regardless of Xenogears' development struggles strangling it in its sleep. While I do not consider Xenogears a good game at the end of the day, it is nonetheless a case where the faults of this first entry would be looked back on and reconsidered in later spiritual sequels or other stories that would be inspired by its story points to better reflect its best elements and reinvent them to in turn be better presented, for the most part. But I am far from the first person to say that the game's faults and contradictions are why it is considered by many to just be impenetrable, despite what it is doing with its story being ridiculously basic in comparison to its successor stories, which are more direct and less convoluted with the presentation of their own complexities. I unfortunately feel like I skipped more than I should have in this last video on this game, however, And there's probably some Xeno fan out there that watched this one and went, you forgot to something in here. But quite frankly, I ran long on this one. And the amount I've summarized in just this video is 25 hours of content where I felt like barely anything happened. I could have just skipped all of that and focused on just the playable sections, since the story itself just cannot stop lore dumping after you flip the discs. It's genuinely exhausting that they couldn't think to simplify it, and as it's pretty clear that what they wanted can be simplified. That is evidenced by the later games in the Xeno series, where they do just that while still cramming a lot of worthwhile story, lore, and world building in it that, quite frankly, I don't feel here. I did not feel connected to this world, these people, and their struggles. I felt like I never wanted to see them again. And then joke's on me once Xenosaga reaches its climax. I did not have that reaction when I recruited Cosmos and Talos in Xenoblade 2. I can tell you that. Though I don't entirely fault that on the story's actual scriptwriter, though I do feel they could have taken a second draft look at what was done here. While Tetsuya Takahashi was the creator for this and came up with the story, most of it was in turn written by Masato Kato, who is best known for script writing not just on Final Fantasy VII, but being the head writer for the grand majority of Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, some of the best RPGs of that era. He was a pretty big star at the time for his engaging story beats he would inject into his tales. So I'm not sure what exactly went wrong here beyond what I've already said for me to not have the same connection others do with his other titles, beyond just how everything is phrased and presented just being this huge stumbling blockade to even those who know what the hell the game is even talking about. As normally he was better than this. And it was worse when genuinely trying to write a review of it. No joke, these 6 videos took me over 2 months to write simply because, as I've said, the amount of text and dialogue thrown at me kept making my eyes glaze over. It would sometimes take me reviewing as much as 10 minutes of footage to just get to the heart of a single story point to write a few sentences summarizing it. I am an enormous windbag with how I format my reviews to do analysis alongside the recap of them, and I was generally struggling all along the length of these scripts to even grasp what was appropriate to talk about that wouldn't just keep ballooning the script to even more unreasonable lengths. I obviously failed, but an attempt was being made. There's just too much that can be cut down and streamlined, and the later games of the series inevitably do that. So to wrap it all around, while Xenogears is an important foundational basis for the games that would follow it, it individually I feel has aged terribly, and actually completing it is tangible work, not fun. If you want to get ahead of me in these recaps, feel free to play the Xenoblade games on the Nintendo Switch, as you'll get everything good from the Xenomotifs with far less of the baggage. And I will see you when I next return to this franchise for the inevitable recap of Xenosaga. As there you won't hear me yelling in anger and frustration until I reach the second of that trilogy.